Today, I have the somewhat unenviable task of trying to recover my way into Robert Avens, the new Gnosis, which proved to be difficult, I would say. Not only philosophically challenging, but difficult to accept some of the conclusions. I think there was an equivalence between phenomenon or image and angel that I found hard to accept. And that would be, let me just check which episode. That is episode 9, Phenomenology into Angelology. And so at the moment, I'm sort of in the context of being halfway through Tom Chetham's The World Turned Inside Out, Henry Corbin and the Angel Out Ahead. And so going back to the new Gnosis, I'm hoping will not confuse me. It's talking about some of the same stuff about Heidegger, about Corbin, about the imaginal, about the daimon. And I'm just going to see what I can find here. I don't really want to give too much more of an introduction because it's too difficult. Frankly, if someone doesn't know kind of where I'm at here and what I'm getting at, like I'm starting at halfway through a chapter. So I'm starting from page 43 in the new Gnosis, which is partway through chapter 2. And that's going to take us into Heideggerian hermeneutics, the hermeneutic circle, and then on into the second section called phenomenal archetype. Let's see what we can find here. Avens says, the upshot of the above considerations from the point of view of archetypal psychology, that's Hillman's psychology, is that phenomenology begins in a world of ensouled phenomena, i.e. on an imaginal level. Corbin expresses the same by saying that, quote, with the help of phenomenology, we're able to examine the way in which man experiences his relationship to the world without reducing the objective data of this experience to data of sense perception or limiting the field of true and meaningful knowledge to the mere operations of rational understanding. So here we see this essentially through Corbin and for James Hillman as well, phenomenology and the imaginal really go together. We're talking about an ensouled world, and it's when we experience the world in that way, in what we can now call a Corbinian way, that it's from that place, from that mode of being, that phenomenology begins, according to these guys, anyway. And so it's a way of revealing our relationship to the world without reducing us to either subject or object, abstraction or sensation. So it's, again, a way to heal Cartesian splits that we've inherited. Let's move on. The Heideggerian phenomenology paves the way for Gnosis by producing the kind of knowing which is not divorced from being. So when knowing and being go together. In this sense, phenomenology is Gnosis, and knowledge that is effectuated in the soul and by the soul. So I would connect here, there's a connection between phenomenology and transformative knowing. It's knowing by transforming oneself. And I think there's a kind of dual sense there that through the practice of phenomenology, one can transform, one can go through these transformations. So there's a way that phenomenology, especially when understood imaginally, involves taking up the perspective of the soul, and it's from out of that perspective that transformation becomes possible. I think it would also be true to say that by practicing the capacity to take up the perspective of the soul, that one is practicing phenomenology, that the phenomenology of things, of experiences, becomes, in a sense, more available, more accessible through the practice of ensoulment or reensoulment. And I feel that those two directions are in a kind of loop. The distinction briefly would be that yes, we can proceed into transformation via phenomenology, but it's also true that phenomenology is not the only way to transformation. And so the point here is that if we arrive at transformation, especially co-transformation of self and world, transformative experience, gnosis, by other means, it's also going to change our phenomenology kind of after the fact. Continuing, quote, the soul in Jung as well as in archetypal psychology, Hillman's psychology, is not a copy of the world, but an autochthonous reality. The angel, so soul as angel, who has no biography imprinted upon its unconscious by outer circumstances. The soul has no specific message to be delivered to the outside world. The soul is the world and the message. So the soul in this way is conceived of as something like dancing or meditation, which don't need to be valuable for an extrinsic reason. You could dance in order to feel better, but the whole point about dancing is that it's just fun. It just feels good, right? It's just what it is. The same with meditation. It's like, oh, you can meditate in order to improve your, whatever, sleep or I don't know. But meditation is just what it is. It's not the point that it's for a certain reason. And the soul here is conceived in the same way. I'm reminded of McLuhan. The medium is the message. The soul is the world and the message. It is a phenomenon that resonates by itself and of itself. The soul is image and imagining, in the sense that the soul is an image of God. And also, the soul is that which imagines, or the imaginal world is inhabited by the soul, so to speak. Quote, images or subtle bodies, quote, do not reflect a borrowed light. They have their own hardness, their own innate gleam and ring. They are not reflections of the world, but the light by which we see the world. That just sort of complexifies, or it's like a poetic, in a sense, gloss on the same idea. So I'm going to move on from that. Avens continues, images are angels. So an image here is conceived as the phenomenon of something, or the image of something. And a soul is one of these things. I can't go too much here into what I mean by phenomenon or image or angel here, because I already covered that. We already did that. Images are angels who are the message, from which we conclude, or rather leap, to the conclusion that phenomenology is angelology. In effect, we have leaped into the famous hermeneutic circle. Okay, so this is the trickiest move here that I can now approach in a slightly different way. So I think I'm mostly stuck on the term angel. And I think what I understand now is that, like, I understand it to be about perspective taking and getting better at taking up the perspective of one's own soul by practicing sort of disidentifying from different unconscious parts or archetypal forces that are influencing us. When we do this, we can liberate the soul from these influences, and this makes it easier to inhabit the imaginal world, by which I mean the by being able to take up the perspective of the soul in that way. In Jungian terms, the self or the God image, or the imago mundi, the imago and the imago mundi, these the self, the deeper self, is able to express itself, is able to fulfill itself. We're able to be more whole. So through the soul, from out of the soul, we're able to inhabit this imaginal world. Again, it's rather, I have to start using this vocabulary now. And the point of that is that when we do that, when we can take up the perspective of the soul in this way, the world is ensouled, and what that means is that there's a far greater emphasis on sort of personification. And we see things in their phenomenal aspect. We see the phenomena of things. And that also entails seeing them as images of themselves. What do I mean by this? Well, for example, when I look at one of their books, which is on my desk, I'm seeing this is an image right here. This isn't the whole, like, what is this right here? Well, it's a portal, and that's just one word to describe it. So whenever we see something just, lying around, objects or whatever, we're seeing images of what that thing is. We're seeing the way it's shining forth, the phenomenon of it. And so this way, when we can experience the world imaginally, which I would say requires intentional practice, obviously, we can understand what is meant by phenomenology is angelology. Because another way of conceiving of things, of images in their personified form is as angels. It's just another term, I would say, to describe the same thing. And that way is inherently more phenomenological, or it is a phenomenological way. Okay, again, that was rather complex. Just to say the bit about the hermeneutic leap, it doesn't have to be a leap there. It's simply if we understand what the terms mean, all of that which I just said, then it doesn't have to be too much of a leap for me. I think the way in which it's a hermeneutic circle, which we're about to explore a little bit more of, kind of means that Corbin talks about this epiphanic, meaning an epiphany of a mode of presence and mode of being that reveals itself to itself. So it's self-disclosing, an act of self-consciousness of the soul coming into consciousness of itself. And it's a hermeneutic circle because it's kind of from that epiphany or from out of that realization that one can practice this way, which is phenomenology or angelology or an imaginal way. And it's a beginning point. That epiphany has to come first in a way. So it's a hermeneutic circle because at that level, there's no gap between the knower and the known. It's a kind of like an existential axiom. It's a beginning point. It's a starting out point. Let's see what Avens says about it. The hermeneutic circle. It's probably worth Googling that term. It's actually hermeneutical circle. So as Avens says, technically the term hermeneutical circle points to the interdependence of the knower and the known. What is to be understood must already preconceptually be known. That's interesting. Here we have the idea that what comes to be known, in a sense, rises up from the depths. It's already known in a preconceptual way, and it arises into consciousness. The image I have is fireworks. There's a way that all the images that we see, all the understanding that we have, all of what's happening, all of what's being realized moment by moment is in a way that's like fireworks going off. And they have a very long sort of lag time leading up to the point where they're happening and happening and happening. For example, we understand the meaning of an individual word by seeing it in reference to the whole of the sentence. And reciprocally, the sentence's meaning as a whole depends on the meaning of individual words. Yep, this is the kind of top-down and bottom-up processing model. It's like we learn the word. No, actually, I don't know that's the right example. So I'm going to continue here. He says, understanding is always a circular or referential operation. So there's I would say, an Ouroboros quality to understanding. It always grounds in itself. A logic cannot fully account for the workings of this circle. So this is related to kind of Heisenberg's uncertainty principle, or Tarski, showing the limits of formal knowledge systems. So there's a way that any logic cannot fully account for its own workings. You have to sort of choose a logic first, which involves a kind of leap, and that's the leap into the hermeneutical circle, because it's from out of that circle that interpretation begins, in a sense. Okay, as Avens says, as logic cannot fully account for the workings of this circle, a kind of leap into the hermeneutical circle becomes necessary, and we come to understand the whole and the parts together. Yeah, I mean, what I would connect here is that anyone just encountering this without the rest of the context is kind of like, what the heck is Sam talking about here? And it's like there's a kind of hermeneutic leap. If you've kind of leaped into the middle of all of this, then it becomes a world, it becomes a whole language and a way of understanding and perceiving. And then, like within that mode, the terms start justifying themselves. But if you just jump in like that, it's harder to understand this part of what is a series without seeing it within the context of the whole. Heidegger, as usual, goes to the radical sense of the term. Hermeneuin, this term again, hermeneuin. That's the kind of the root of hermeneutics, which I would believe to be Greek, as Heidegger likes doing this etymology. Quote, he maintains that this term, hermeneuin, bears profound affinity with the winged-footed god messenger god Hermes. Hermeneuin, as in Hermes. Hermes brings fateful tidings from the divine. He is a go-between from gods to men, the interpreter. Yeah, so here I would understand through Corbin now, I can understand that we have this like certain capacity to make these leaps into different hermeneutics, into different logics, right? Into different modes of perception. And that is in some way that power or capacity one could regard as a divine capacity. There's something divine about it. Otherwise, one could understand that I've kind of got that wrong, and that it's after we've performed that leap into a certain hermeneutics that Hermes assists us with interpretation. The idea here, I mean, you really have to stretch to accommodate this stuff because it's really quite radical. It's like, so there's a way that if we can realize that the ensouled world in a way comes first, it's prior, it's preconceptual in some way. If we inhabit the imaginal world in this way, then ascribing relevance to gods such as Hermes becomes far more of an option in a sense. It's not quite as out of the question to consider hermeneutics to be in some way related to the capacity. There's a kind of hermetic capacity namely hermeneutics, that in personified form could be understood as Hermes. Moving on. Again, I know it's a lot. To Heidegger, hermeneutics has to do not with historical methods of interpretation as against scientific methods, but with the event of understanding as such. I mean, look, if we try to understand the event of understanding, like phenomenologically or in a Heideggerian way, is it not miraculous that there is an event of understanding? What is it that determines about us that we can understand that there should be such moments? This is a miraculous capacity, and it's by no means out of the sphere. Like it's from that point of view quite reasonable to attribute such phenomena to you could say deific forces. Anyway, moving on. Heidegger sees philosophy itself as interpretation. Hermes, quote, brings the message of destiny. Hermeneuin is that laying open of something or exposition, which brings a message. This is what I'm trying to do now, right? I'm trying to lay it out or expose to do exposition of the text. Hermeneutics. Hermeneuin is that laying open of something, exposition, which brings a message. Such laying open becomes a laying out or interpretation, explaining of that which was already said through the poets, who themselves, according to Socrates in Plato's dialogue Ion, are messengers of the gods. Okay, continuing here, because I don't want to get hung up too much on that. Hillman speaks of our archetypal hermeneutics, by which he means the study of soul. So again, I realize that this is quite far out. What am I really getting at here? What do we mean by the study of soul or archetypal hermeneutics? The idea is that it is that we in fact have souls that I'm not going to talk about what I mean by that right here. I'll just for the moment say that it has to do with that about us which is unique and alive that we are not in touch with often. So when we're a cog in the machine and when our life in the system is like crushing us and all, this is not very full of soul, right? Or full of aliveness. So the idea is that there are ways of living, there are ways of practicing intentionally to unlock or cultivate the capacity which has been atrophied to take up the perspective of the soul. And I believe that the many different traditions, Christian, Gnostic, hermeneutic, alchemical, all point to that as being a good thing to do, as in the thing to do. And it's from out of that perspective, like if we understand that that is in fact an option that is available to us, it's from out of that perspective that we practice phenomenology, that we experience the world in a personified and ensouled way, that we experience the world imaginally. Yes, and it's when we can inhabit the soul, then this is how we get to talk about what Hillman means by archetypal hermeneutics, by which he means the study of soul. And Hillman says, to study soul, we must go deep. When we go deep, soul becomes involved. The metaphors that we believe we choose for describing archetypal processes and ideas are inherently part of those processes and ideas themselves. There is an archetypal selective factor involved in the invention of terms. To lead meanings out of language suggests that the meaning is already there. So to me, this reminds me very much of the body and embodied cognition. I'm thinking of, again, George Lakoff, Philosophy in the Flesh and Metaphors We Live By, and also Merleau-Ponty. This is basically, it's the idea that, yeah, there is a certain body to things. Again, I feel that this archetypal selective factor that they're talking about is in fact the body. There would be in this instance a deep relationship between the body and the soul. which I'll just conveniently skip over for the moment. I feel that it's from out of the, yeah, I think it's from out of the interaction between body and soul that things like metaphors get chosen. I think archetype, body, and soul all interact to quote lead meanings out of language. But it's very abstract and difficult, so I'm just going to leave that there and try to get to the stuff which is new. Quote, there are, however, other passages in Hillman's opus, The Dream and the Underworld, I think, in which he discards the adjective of hermeneutic in favor of imagistic. So here Avens wants to talk about the difference between hermeneutic and imagistic. He says, I shall discuss this important change in a moment. For now, we must explore some of the implications of the circle, hermeneutic or not. Okay, so what is meant by this? Again, we're talking about hermeneutics here. We're talking about the phenomenology, the imaginal world. We're talking about the work of reensoulment. These are all going together at this level. We're talking about particularly the hermeneutic leap, which is the leap of inhabiting certain logics, certain modes of being, from out of which we can understand the world and ourselves in a certain way. And Avens wants to talk about the implications of the circular quality of this. I described a kind of Ouroboros quality, which involves a kind of epiphany or pre-perceptual knowing, from out of which interpretation of hermeneutics begins. Okay, he says, it's important to recognize that the kind of knowing gained within the circle has nothing to do with Cartesian certainty, wholeness, or the like. There are no specific or practical results that would ensue from circling. Okay, so what I'm getting here is that it's a kind of gnosis, it's a kind of knowing, so it's a realization, it's a quality of awakening or epiphany. So it's not about arriving at Cartesian certainty. It's not about extrinsic reasoning about this is useful for something. I think there are some risks that I can see there that I'll just, again, skip over for a moment. I can also see that I do feel that this process of becoming more conscious is in some way connected to wholeness per Jung, but I'll leave that behind as well. So there's something, but what we're getting at here is that it's not about this Cartesian logic. It's a deeper kind of knowing, which is more of a realization, more of an existential quality. It says, rather, one is transported into, quote, a more problematic and dynamic experience. The concealing, unconcealing, or truth error process of being. So it's a state which is in some way accepting of paradox, a more problematic and dynamic experience. The reason for this polemical state of affairs is that the circle of Dasein being there is endless in the Heraclitean sense of depth. There are no limits to the soul's circulation, no actualization of darkness into light or error into truth. There is no final healing vision, as for example in Hegel, no finality of any kind, except the finality of infinitude. Yeah, so to me, this is a kind of what we're talking about is a kind of it's a kind of existential place or mode of being. It's a form of it's a kind of awareness, and it has qualities that admit of paradox. And here, it's described as having qualities of not being finite or definite or final. It's more having the quality of transcendence or infinity and having an indefinite nature. And this is connected with the quality of the soul. The soul has this Empyrean, flightful quality. Obviously, we see the dangers of this. Yeah, so I would say you want to be really careful of anima possession per Jung. So we are not the soul that we have. The soul here conceived as the daemon or divine double, Socratic daimonion, Viveki's sacred second self. So this character is very much not us, and we want to be very careful of the freedom, the infinitude that it demands. I'd submit Hubert no, not Dreyfus, Drew Hyland, finitude and transcendence in the Platonic dialogues. The whole point is to get this cycling quality between both. So although these moments of epiphanic awareness that cultivate our developmental capacity to inhabit the imaginal world through phenomenology or angelology, however you want to put it, archetypal hermeneutics, that's awesome, but we also want to bring this stuff down back to the level of the ego, bring it down into life. So I'm pointing to a kind of imbalance, which I think would make this a kind of partial truth. Okay, I'm gonna keep going here. He says, the road that the soul travels, the hodos, according to Heraclitus, is an up and down way. Like the beginning, arche, and the end, para, are the same. So I think he's kind of talking about circumambulation here, the way that the progression, the development of the soul is sort of non-linear in a certain way. And I would say that these qualities may be true to the soul, but I think we as ego definitely experience the differences between these different states or stages. So beginning and end may be the same in some way, maybe from the point of view of the soul. But I think there's also a way that to us, who are very limited and finite, these are not the same. Anyway, he says, the Heraclitean end is not a simple or literal return to the same, nor a unilinear messianic utopia. Miller describes it as a depth, a perimeter broken through like a horizon exploded. The deep end is ultimately soul, which is without end. So to me here, this has a quality of spiral dynamics. It's not, what Heraclitus means by the end in this context, the end of the road that the soul travels, is that it kind of has to do with eternity. It's not about a linear end point, and it's not about a return to sameness, which is kind of dull and boring. There's a kind of spiral dynamic where each time it goes around, it's pretty much the same, but it's also a bit different in a certain way. Both of those being true, again, at the same time. This bit is quite difficult. So I'm just going to get over the page here a little bit more, and I'll stop before the second section. Miller's sentence, of course, refers to the circle of Hermes Megistus. Again, this is a hermeneutic circle, whose center is everywhere. It is, as we observed earlier, what Heidegger means by being. Okay, so we're talking about the hermeneutical circle and the leap into it. It's a kind of I understand it to be a kind of epiphany. It's a a metaphysical axiom, a mode of being, a leaving off point that reveals the interdependence of knower and known, through deep kind of existential or ontological understanding. And it's from that place that ensoulment, the imaginal world, phenomenology all transpire. And hermeneutics begins from that place. And we've been talking about the development of the soul in those terms. When we get this quality of the soul's circulation or progression in some sense, how does that make sense in terms of this circle? And we're obviously taking this back to hermeneutics, hermeneuin as in Hermes. And so again, through the Hermetic tradition, the tradition of Hermes Trismegistus as the thrice blessed. Go look up hermeneutics if you don't know what I mean. And the point is, there's that Hermes Trismegistus has a circle of some kind whose center is everywhere. And what I've expressed by this is that it's a certain diagram I wish I could show you. So there's a dot with a circle in the middle, and then that's like a model of our experience of the world, right? We are an agent in an arena. We are a person and we're in a world. This is how we experience things. And as we move through these stations of the soul, as we move through our developmental trajectory, or as we make these leaps into different hermeneutic modes of being, as things change, it's not that the dot moves to a different point of the circle, it's that the whole dot and the whole circle change. So we actually are a different being in a different world. And so the changing, evolving spiral dynamic of the soul in world is what we're talking about. And that paints a kind of a vaster circle. So the spiral dynamic points to the trajectory of the development of the soul. So that means at the moment that there's two things that we could be meaning by circle. One of them is the world which is currently inhabited by the agent, be it the soul or the ego, surrounded by the circle of the world, imaged by the dot within the circle. But the transformation of that self and world, soul and world, transformation of that describes another circle, a larger one, which I've described with this spiral dynamic in terms of spiral dynamics. And so it says, we may conclude, therefore, that the leap referred to by Heidegger must be a leap into this vaster circle, a circle that is circumscribed by the Ouroboros course of the anima mundi. I won't go deeply into that. I'll simply say, obviously, that when our identity changes, well, then the world changes along with it. And so when we can inhabit the soul, then the soul of the world becomes available or visible. That's what's meant by anima mundi in this context. We can also see that the spiral dynamic, perceived from two dimensions, has an Ouroboros quality. It's self-consuming and it sort of stays the same, but it's also changing. Okay, this is the most difficult part. I have one page and then I'm stopping, okay? I don't know that anyone will ever follow this, but that's maybe okay. So that's what allows Avens to say, there are hosts of angels on this course. difficult to understand. So then he says, but as we know, angels are far from being harmless or benign. Every angel is terrifying, says Rilke. So angels in this context can be understood as the different stages or modes of being. So like now like this, and now like this, and now like this. These can be understood as angels. But I think it would also be true to say that when we take up these different modes of being, the different images that we relate with can appear as angels or can be described in the same way as angels. So whether it's stations along the way or the inhabitants of each station, there's a lot of angels, apparently. Okay, so then he says, angels are terrifying because, in Miller's words, their way is to let go of things. The letting go involves one in a giving up of grasping from a perspective of ego. We are urged to let go of things for the purpose of a reorientation from the ego perspective toward an imaginal view of things. From the human anima toward anima mundi. From man to being. That is also a move toward imagination, quote, a great beast, a subtle body, an anima mundi, both diaphanous and passionate, unerring in its patterns and in all ways necessary, the necessary angel that makes brute necessity angelic. Again, so frustrating for me to try to grapple with this, but okay, I feel there's a few mistakes here that I want to try and get. So it seems that what this is pointing to is that when we can inhabit this ensouled way, it's where it's against ego in some way. So it has the quality of surrendering. So I would connect sort of die and become. This surrendering involves a letting go, and it's a kind of letting go of the world that we've been in that we need in order to inhabit a new world. So possessiveness is disincentivized. Possession, mine, ego, which is that would be conceived as a kind of trap for closing our transformation. So when we can give up grasping from the perspective of the ego, then yeah, so sort of angels encourage. So the way of angels is to let go. It seems that the way of the soul is also to do that. Soul as angel. So it seems that the more that we can surrender, the more that we can let go of things from this point of view, the more that we can engage imaginally. So I would describe this as a kind of unbinding. There's a way that the numinous or horrifying aspect, the numinosity of angels that can be accessed through this imaginal way can be horrifying, and it can deeply get us out of the traps, the existential entrapment that we create for ourselves. So it can be shocking. But there are several other mistakes here. He described that it was from the ego perspective toward an imaginal view of things. And that's fine. I think like it makes sense to me that if we can cultivate this capacity for taking up the perspective of the soul, that this is sort of away from the ego in a certain way, and that could be healthy. I can understand that, especially if we can avoid anima possession. But the mistake here, I think, would be when he said, from the human anima toward anima mundi. So what I understand is that in a way, the anima and the anima mundi are on a continuum. So the soul and the soul of the world. So I've talked about the extended soul. So the idea being that when we can inhabit the perspective of the soul, it's not just sort of like an isolated node in a network, but a whole field of relationality opens up. And that's what I would describe as anima mundi, so the extended network of ensoulment. It's a quality of soul which is arising from out of the world. But I can certainly understand that when we can take up this kind of perspective, it's not that the perspective of the soul is sort of valorized over and above the perspective of the soul of the world. They go together. So I think maybe what he's pointing to is that it's not just that the ego becomes less of the center, it's that when the soul is at the center, the soul is in some way more inherently capable of, you could say, perceiving the interconnectedness of all things or relating. Okay, I'm going to do the final paragraph here to summarize this. I'll try to do so because it's really quite hard. And then we'll finish this. So he says, the Heideggerian version of the Heideggerian version of Husserl's callback to the things themselves, Husserl's call back to the things themselves, which has been, so Heidegger's version of that, back to the things themselves, which has been supplemented by Jung, Hillman, and Miller, can now be summarized as follows. Being as a phenomenon is intelligible in that it is always pre-understood, not conceptually, just like the psyche always understands itself in its images. Being as a phenomena is intelligible in that it is always pre-understood non-conceptually, just like the psyche always understands itself in its images. If, however, we are to avoid the vicious repetition involved in the psyche's circling, it's imperative to make circling somehow angelic. Circling must take place on the imaginal level, proceeding to an ever greater depth and revealing not what things are, but how they are. So I feel here that he's trying to talk about a kind of self-creation via the soul. It's by the work of ensoulment, by imaginal work, that we can, I would say, engage in aspirational development or Jungian individuation. So there's a self-creation and self-transformation process. And there's a way that we can get stuck at a certain level. So I would describe a need for a kind of reciprocal opening or opponent processing to facilitate that. That would be through Jung. The risk would be that the soul is sort of excessively romantic or something like that, that it that enjoys a certain way of experiencing something rather than being oriented to the onward transformations that are required. Anyway, it's just terribly inaccessible, this part, but I'm trying to get through it. So he says, again, if, however, we are to avoid the vicious repetition involved in the psyche's circling, it's imperative to make circling somehow angelic. Circling must take place on the imaginal level, proceeding to an ever greater depth and revealing not what things are, but how they are. The howness of things is their phenomenality and their imaginational physiognomy, that is, their angelicity. By all accounts, this is bound to be a terrifying discovery requiring radical displacement of priorities. the ontological prius now becomes esse in anima, understood as Dasein or being. An esse that is in its own justification and that Heidegger will call Erinus, event of appropriation, or simply play. So I have to say that that last paragraph didn't mean a whole lot to me. I think what we're simply talking about here is a kind of phenomenological, or by extension, imaginal way of describing the necessity for taking up the point of view of the soul. It's sort of describing in Heideggerian terms what the meaning of that change is. Like if we understand the imperative to do that, either through Corbin's imaginal enactment, the imaginal world, or through Jungian individuation, the consequence of that is that the soul and the angels in the stations along the way of the soul's development that we encounter become a kind of ontological ground from out of which we personify the world, experience the world in a different mode of being, and develop ourselves on a path of aspirational development. And I'm going to leave this here because I don't want this to be too long. So I will. Yeah, I will simply add at the end that we talked about anima or soul as here you can see esse in anima is Dasein or being, a deeper mode of being. An esse that is its own justification, so it's kind of inherently valuable, not valuable for some sort of extrinsic reason, that Heidegger is going to call Erinus or play. And I just want to add at the end here that Jung and others have described how play is sort of neuroanatomically fragile. And there's a way that for me, the whole point of this kind of attitude of the soul, of taking up the perspective of the soul, is that it's designed to help us take perspective on pairs of opposites that we're crucified between. And the ego experiences the pain of that crucifixion between pairs of opposites. It's in a conflict that in some way reveals the priority of the soul. And that's why Jung talks about the will, the freedom of the will, which we could simply understand as agency or our directedness, self-determining quality. He talks about that as necessary because if we understand this simply as play, not that play is unimportant, play is extremely important, but there's a way that it's quite a fragile condition, and that we may want to tie this work of ensoulment, being in and from out of the soul, to something which can be serious play, something which is strong, robust, able to cope with paradox and conflict, not something which will disappear or vanish in a puff of smoke at the first sign of difficulty. Okay, well, that was the impenetrable Robert Avens. It's not impenetrable, it's just talking about a lot all at once. 43 through 48. And I'll come back to section 2 in the chapter, Phenomenal Archetype.